Okay, I think I'm live. Welcome everyone to 10-Minute 2-Tip Tuesday. This week, I'm your host, Amelia Borland, occupational therapist, owner and founder of Higher Standards Caregiver Training, and I have a couple super valuable tips for you today, as always. So if you are new to 10-Minute 2-Tip Tuesday, let me fill you in really fast on what is about to happen. I'm going to give you two super valuable tips. Kitty might help today. He's joining me, because he's a cat and he does what he wants. I'm going to give you two super valuable tips. The first is for caregivers and the second is for caregiving organizations. Before we get started, quick reminder, tomorrow at noon, I'm going to be back with the great Lori Miller, fantastic Jeff Syke, and we're going to be talking all about the difference between home health and home care, and what that means, and how these types of organizations are different, but also how they can and should work together to provide the best care possible, regardless of what kind of organization it is. So if that's something that you're interested in, maybe if it's an industry or a part of the industry that you're not familiar with, maybe you are a caregiver, a family caregiver, or maybe it just piques your curiosity, then please join us live for that discussion. It's going to be tomorrow at noon, and it's going to be live streamed. So join us for that. Anyway, other thing, real fast, before we move on to our first tip today, as always, this is for educational purposes only. So if anything that I say reminds you of someone that you know, maybe even yourself, someone that you care for, whoever it is, if anything that I say reminds you of someone who you think needs to be seen or treated by a licensed healthcare provider, then please make sure you are advocating for that person to get that appropriate treatment, as this is really and truly for educational purposes only. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. First tip for today is for family caregivers. Family caregivers, non-medical caregivers. If you're a caregiver, this tip is for you. So I'm sitting in a wheelchair, I'm sure you noticed. And that is to illustrate, okay, so what's one of the things that we say always is the most important things about safety with wheelchair? Like, what's one of the most important safety issues with wheelchairs? I'm sure if you are a caregiver, you're like shouting it right now, and that is to make sure that the brakes are locked, right? Because a wheelchair is only safe, or one of the most important things to make wheelchairs safe during transfers and when someone is not moving, is to make sure that those brakes are locked. But that's not the tip for today. But what about power chairs? Power chairs traditionally do not have a set of brakes that you reach down and lock. And that's because power chairs only work when the gears are engaged, when it's on, when it's told to go. So if you can't lock the brakes on a power chair, how do you make sure that your power chair isn't going to go anywhere when you're doing a transfer, or when you're not attempting to move, or that person who's in the power chair is not actually trying to go anywhere? How do you do that if there's no physical brakes that you lock? Turn the chair off. That is absolutely one of the most essential safety tips for power chairs, is if the person in it is not actively trying to go somewhere, then that power chair needs to be off. It is so easy to accidentally hit the joystick, or whatever is the way that power chair is controlled. Obviously, there are many different ways to control power chairs nowadays. But a joystick is the most common. It's what you're going to see the most common, right? It is so easy to accidentally hit that joystick or press that button with a hand or an elbow, or even your backside if you turn around, right? And if you hit that on accident when someone is not trying to go somewhere or during a transfer, that becomes a very, very dangerous situation. Power chairs are heavy. They move with a lot of force. It's really easy for either you or the person that you're assisting to become injured if that chair starts moving when you're not expecting it to. Hopefully no one who's watching this has ever been run over by a power chair or hit by a power chair. I certainly hope not. But the fact is those types of injuries are really, really common, and they're also really, really easy to avoid. And you avoid them by making sure that that chair is off. If the person in it is not trying to move, period. It should just be off unless they're going somewhere. Okay, so that is tip number 1 today for caregivers. Tip number 2 for caregiving organizations, we're going to really get back down to basics today. So one of the things that you hear me talk about a lot when I'm talking about training programs is the fact that training programs need to be delivered at a high frequency. You can't just train your caregivers once or even every 6 months or annually, right? You can't just train your caregivers at those very few points of contact. And I'm going to give you some really good reasons why, okay? So one of the reasons that you need to have a more frequent, a higher level of frequency for a training program is because you have caregiver turnover, right? If you're only doing company trainings every 6 months or every year or even quarterly, let's face it, if you're only doing trainings that often, what about all of the caregivers that you're hiring in the meantime? How long are they going before they get that training reinforcement at company trainings, right? So that's something that you need to be thinking about. You know, if your turnover is 50, 60, 70, 80%, how many of your caregivers are actually being touched by that training that you're trying to provide, if it's only, you know, even quarterly, semi-annually, or annually? So think about that. The other kind of flip side of that is too, that the more frequently we provide high quality training to our caregivers and the more accessible that training is, that tends to significantly lower turnover. So not only are you actually getting to your caregivers more often with that training and education, but your caregivers are sticking around for it as part of why they are with your organization. And of course, that helps with all kinds of problems. We won't even get into that here. Okay, another really good reason why you want high frequency for your caregiver training programs is because on average, people, I'm not talking caregivers, I'm talking humans, humanity. We need to hear things at least 7 times before they start to sink in. 7 times. So doing a quick check off when you're hiring someone and then maybe training them, you know, again, annually or semi-annually or something like that, it's going to take a really long time to get those 7 points of contact. On the other hand, if you have a training program that is really, really easy to access and has a high frequency of touch points for actual interactive trainings, you're going to be much more likely to quickly hit those high notes, hit the things that you really want to make sure your caregivers are getting and understanding 7 times, right? So that is a really important thing to consider, that if we want our caregivers to do something a certain way, if we want them to follow a certain standard of care, then we need to be touching base with them about that, again, about 7 times. And that's not just for caregivers, that's humanity, that's people. Okay, I think I had one more thing written down about this. Oh, yeah, I don't know how I was gonna forget this. Okay, so here's a third really good reason to have a high frequency training program that is super easy to access for your caregivers. Habit. You can tell someone, you can demonstrate to them, you can educate to them how something should be done, or how your company wants it done, or the best technique for something. You can demonstrate that for them, and they can say, oh my gosh, that's amazing, that's wonderful. I never thought about it that way. But then they go back to work, they go back to work with their clients, and if their habit is to do it a different way, if their habit is to do it the way they've been doing it for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, even if that maybe that's not the safest or the most effective or the most efficient method, chances are they're going to go back to that habit. So in order to actually change people's habits and get them to adopt habits that do things more safely, that do things more efficiently, that do things more effectively, that follows that company policy. If you want them to adopt that and have that be their habit, then we have to be really frequently reinforcing the habits that we want our caregivers to have. And again, that's not just actually a caregiver thing, that's a human thing. We all get into habits and we will default into those habits. If you want your caregivers to have the safest habits, the most effective habits, the habits that you need for your company to operate according to policy and run smoothly and keep your clients safe and your caregivers safe and everyone happy, then you want to have many points, frequent points of reinforcement for those habits so that they can actually adopt them. Because it's not that people don't want to do things the safest way, it's not that people don't want to do things the most effective way, but if you haven't been doing it that way for years and your habit is something else, it's hard to break that unless you have a very high frequency point of contact to help you break that habit. And one last thing that I'll add, it wasn't on my list, one last thing that I'll add is the more you demonstrate your commitment as a company, as an organization, the more you demonstrate your commitment to safety, to efficiency, to effectiveness, to quality. The more you demonstrate that through your program, the more your caregivers are going to understand and embrace that same culture. If you take it seriously, your caregivers are going to be much more likely to take it seriously too, right? So all great reasons to think about how frequently you're training your caregivers, how easily accessible is the information, is the training, is the content that you want your caregivers to be consuming. Okay, so that's it for me today for 10-minute I usually don't mess that up, 10-minute 2-Tip Tuesday. If you joined me live, then thank you so much for watching. I sincerely appreciate you. If you're watching the recording, I hope you are enjoying it. And of course, I will be back next week with 2 more super valuable tips in 10 minutes. Until then, y'all, please be healthy, be well, and most of all, take care. Bye, everyone.